Holy. So, I hope you guys all had some lunch, had an opportunity to talk and network. I think I do encourage you on a day like this to try and sit with other people and try and talk to other people in other environments and exchange contacts and stuff. That's also what this day is about. So we're just going to have our next keynote presentation. So this is going to be a dual presentation from Barnaby and Professor Sergio. Sergio is renowned for his expertise in sports coaching. He's co-founded iCoach Kids and consults on some global organisations like IOC, Nike, FIFA. And Barnaby was a PhD student here. He actually
still is.
It's
5 weeks.
He actually has his Viva in 5 weeks' time, so if you can think of really nasty questions to ask him at the end, that'll really prepare him. But Barney has gone on to pass his degree and is now a lecturer at Edge Hill University. He specialises in youth, sport and talent, development, and specifically kind of health and well-being. And he's also a qualified hockey coach and also a physical education teacher. And he contributes to the GB Hockey Coaches Advisory Group as well. So we're really lucky to have them both here today. So over to you.
Thank you. Hi everyone, you okay? Very good. I don't know how many of you know much about iCoach Kids. Put your hand up if you know anything about iCoach Kids, a little bit. Okay. Well look, I've got the easy job today. I'm going to do a quick introduction of what iCoach Kids is, okay? And then I'm going to hand over to Barney to talk about the research that he's been doing within the context of that program, okay? First of all, a big thank you to Fiona and Kev for the opportunity. But really, iCoach Kids was born in 2016. We used funds from an Erasmus grant to bring together 7 or 8 partners from across Europe to try and understand a bit more how coach education and how children's coaching, youth coaching was happening in Europe. We had an inkling, because we have done a lot of coach education in the UK, that what happens when you go to a level 1 or a level 2 course is that you tend to get a lot of information about the sport. So in my case, I'm a basketball coach, so I go to do my level 1 or my level 2 and they tell me a lot about basketball, but not a lot about children and not a lot about coaching. So iCoach Kids wanted to plug that gap. And we had 3 years and a bit of money from the European Union to put together a number of resources for coaches of children, to help them understand better coaching and children, because then the MGBs take care of the actual sport. Okay. That went really well. We ended up with free online courses and a website with 300 plus resources. We've got a YouTube channel again with a lot of videos there as well. And that went really well, so we actually reapplied for funding. And we got a second batch of funding. And in that case, we wanted to explore new ideas, really, in the same space, but new ideas. In the first iCoach Kids grant, we looked at 5 to 12-year-olds. In the second batch, we looked at 13 to 18-year-olds. Why? Because we knew that at that point, 2 things happen. Okay? As children get older, some of them drop out of sport, and we wanted to understand a bit more why and how to help clubs and coaches minimize dropout. But also, it's a bit paradoxical. A lot of them drop out, but then some of them go into the talent pathway and their commitment levels go through the roof. So we also wanted to understand what happens to those children and how can we make their life better. And that's where the whole idea of holistic talent development comes in. We ran this worldwide search for a PhD student. We ended up with Barney. Okay? Top of the class. Okay? So no, we were very lucky to get Barney on board. Barney's been working for the last 4 years on doing some really cool work that has been really impactful. For example, based on the work that Barney's done with the PhD, the IOC released a new e-learning module based on a lot of the work that Barney's done. And we're just finishing another one with FIFA at the moment, using a lot of the work that Barney's done. So please welcome Barney. Thank you.
Thanks, Sergio. Thanks for that introduction. And again, thanks, Kev and Fika, for the invitation. It's so great to actually have a keynote and be in such a good big crowd. I'm always used to doing small, pokey presentations, so this is great. So for me today, building on what Sergio said then, I've got kind of 3 key main messages to get going. For me, I kind of want for us collectively to critically consider the role of your role, the role of the sports system, that talent development system. Specifically your role in that system, as well as a coach, if that's a director, SSC coach, for example. And then the social, ecological, psychological structures that might be within the environment or the systems that we work in as well, and how they have an impact on different athlete outcomes. So I think a fair question to ask, given we're an LTA conference, is how does that all fit with holistic talent development? Hopefully we'll try and answer that question a little bit. Firstly though, I'd just like to have to think about who works or do you work in a talent development environment. So if you put your hand up if you consider you work in a TDE. Okay. If I was to say now, if we define a talent development environment as an environment that has some aspect of selection or identification, and is on some sort of pathway toward the next stage of development or performance, put your hand up. More or less people. So a few more. So that's really how I'd kind of define a talent development environment within a talent system. So typically, especially the work that we've done, we position that in kind of governing body or kind of private sporting organisation. So that could be your classic governing body pathway. So for me in hockey, that's our school, county, national, academy, national age group system. Within the kind of football, we all know the Premier League academy system is the model there for that talent system. But only reflecting on kind of the role of LCAD, the S&C coach, what I'm learning a little bit today around private schools, independent schools, is that maybe there's an aspect of those environments also kind of being a talent system. So therefore you may be also working in a talent development environment. And that's why I'm reflecting on the sort of maybe that games model you have in some of these schools. So let's dive a little bit deeper into the, kind of the typical model for a talent system. Again, this is typical for a national governing body structure, is that system really works in a way that takes a big population and through a process of selection, identification, development, essentially tries to whittle that group down through resource, through input, to get to a smaller pool where selection happens, where performance happens, and that process continues to get in the system of that dropout. For some, unfortunately, performance for some, and then all the way for your peak athletes at Olympic professional level. Really, that's that classic pyramid model of sport. We go from big to small to small to small. That's kind of pretty twisted if we're talking about, and we'll come on to this, our idea of what we might think about what success is in our performance or talent development environment. So continue on a little bit, look at the landscape then. Again, just to reiterate, kind of the work we've done, the work I coach kids has been really within the kind of classic talent development environment space. So we've kind of focused on governing bodies and that sort of landscape. But I'd ask you a question, how does this reflect the environment you work in, particularly today? So have a look at this. This is the kind of typical model that's existed for ages, really. But what we've kind of seen, I'd say, I don't know, maybe the last decade, last 2 decades, is certainly a proliferation in the professionalisation, sophistication, and a systematic design and operation of talent development as a pathway with a really clear goal. And that has existed for a long time, but we're talking about more money, more resource into that system, generally more professionalised. And we see that in many, many different ways. So, you know, that's really comes with resource and policy impetus and that sort of thing. And we see that kind of being enacted through things like lots of media coverage of youth athletes, so the kind of commercialisation of youth sport generally. Money into systems, buying players. So the best example there for me is kind of Jude Bellingham deal, £22 million for an academy player at 17. I mean, that's not professionalising youth sport, I don't know what is. Another great example for me is a couple of years ago now, Youth FA Cup final held in Old Trafford, I think it was. 62,000 people went to watch a bunch of 18-year-olds, and I'm being cynical here, a bunch of 18-year-olds paid tickets to watch them, which for me is just a youth development environment, but you've got 62,000 people turning up to watch them. I know there's good and bad things to look at there, but to me that's high professionalisation. And then another way you might look at it is kind of media coverage, just generally. So things like your Amazon Prime documentary on Leeds Academy, YouTube videos on different football academies, More recently, you've got a whole tennis show sponsored by Lexus about upcoming British stars in tennis. You know, I'm going to offer a critical perspective, so you know we can say there's lots of good things that come through this, lots of opportunities for athletes, but for a moment to look at the kind of challenges that come with that. Okay, important, we are painting a bit of a broad brush here. So we're looking big picture, looking at the system. And there's a few kind of examples and maybe some of the broad challenges that come with this professionalised model of talent development. Okay, and you'll surely be familiar with some of the high-profile cases that come with sport. So more money, more professionalisation, more intensity, more training time, more really just focus on the developing athlete, more staff, more structured environments, more rules for athletes, younger athletes, all these different things that happen as a result of this professionalisation. And some really good examples. We see, you know, the White Review in gymnastics, duty of care, a sport report came out in 2017 as well. More recently, examples in swimming, we've seen that recently. You name it, there's been a few. Of course, these are just big media things, but you know the impact is real for athletes. So let's look a little bit more about what those particular impacts might be. Again, I'm painting a broad brush, okay? But we're just looking at kind of the critical perspective of the environment. Okay, and colleagues that we work with have done more work on kind of the balance of positive and negative outcomes. So Fion's done that work, Fika's done that work. Okay, that work's out there, but kind of a bit look at the effect on athletes. So we can really broadly group these into, I would say, maybe two broad themes with an underpinning point to this. So athletes are spending more time in environments, with that maybe more sacrifice, extremely generally time exhaustive. We know that, you know, from long old literature that deliberate practice literature takes a long time to get to the level that you maybe need to perform in any sport. So we know that maybe that comes with some social and educational sacrifice. People like to say it's a choice, but that depends if the athletes make that choice or not. So that's our broad point number one. Broad point number two is that negative health impact. So that could be anything from physical, social, psychological impacts, athletic identity, burnout. You all know the physical ones of the group. Those actual effects on health that happen maybe short or long term, mental health as well. So undercut both of those points with that period review of the system, which is 2%. 2% will make it. You know, it's a nice bubbly number. That's a big general summary of kind of a wide literature on that space. So 2% of you athletes involved in talent systems attain elite success. Yet that whole model generally is primarily built on getting athletes to the final stage. So a few other numbers from different authors. So Joe Baker, professional basketball 1 in 70,000, football 1 in 25,000. So that's from your normative grassroots population. Okay, so that grassroots population, 1 in 70. And then soccer, that's actually Football Premier League data from their review, 10-year review. So out of the cohort of players that started in 1999, of that cohort from Category 1, academies, 1.4% of players went on to play 20 or more Premier League appearances. 1.4. And it's much worse from Category 2, less than that. So unsurprisingly, that's been relatively well known for a little while now. There's been kind of discourse rhetoric that comes out as kind of challenges a little bit. If we read those quotes there from the International Olympic Committee, really that's kind of been a big review that came out in 2015 that's kind of collectively looked at the challenges of youth sport. And it makes a bit of a pledge or a bit of a question over, can we look at things a little bit differently, or at least a critique of kind of what's going on. And this is pretty blue sky thinking for the International Olympic Committee, interestingly. The goal is clear: develop healthy, capable, resilient young athletes. For me, probably the big thing is a wider definition of sports success. Whole person, athlete, and development of the person. Whole athlete and development of the person. So that's a bit of a, maybe some sort of a reconfiguration of what we might think about the goal of talent, performance, youth sport. So is it time for us to think about that practically? So this was great, didn't really give us any answers, only consensus statement. There's definitely work needed to kind of dive into a bit more. So is there a time for a new model of talent development? Firstly, let's have a look, think about what a model is. A model is just an integration of kind of different, integration of theory that provides some sort of structure to guide practice or guide research. There's a few out there in talent development. Ones you'll be more or less familiar with. I'm sure you'll be familiar with something like this. Also than I will be, but we've got other ones that look at, more or less focused on physical, psychological, social development. They look at development across a time. They look at development at one time point. These models are kind of there to underpin and show practice. So we've got a whole wide range that exist in kind of talent, youth, sport. And that's that pyramid model that we refer to. So two models that already exist actually are really, really helpful in this sense. So talent development environments. So we've got some pretty good research in this space from Ross Martin-Dale, Chris Hennickson as well, that's kind of described what makes an effective talent development environment from the perspective of winning. And some of the stuff you heard mentioned today already, but this is a pretty good start actually. So we know what makes an effective talent development environment. They've got long-term planning, goals, structures. They've got communication, clear messaging. They've got lots of stakeholder support. They work with parents. They emphasise development, not early success. They're highly individualised. They work with different stakeholders in a positive manner. They recognise the role of different cultural, policy, political structures. So we know this already. The issue with our existing evidence and what we know is that it's really focused on primarily the success of these environments. So an environment fulfills these outcomes or these processes, they're doing this really, really well. We don't have quite a better, as good an understanding of maybe the challenges or how our environment might attend to those challenges that we know. That's just a definition for us to base our thinking on a talent development environment. Physical, social environment, network of direct and indirect influences interact with an athlete's current ability. So we're going to look a little bit more into the environment in a minute. So bear that in mind, bear these structures, these models in mind for later on. So perhaps there is a bit of a question then, how might we go about framing talent development? So this is where our work really started in terms of our research. So this looks simple, but this was 3 years of reading to get to some more refined definitions. And this is the basis of the holistic talent development model, which is a proposition that effective holistic talent development, an environment that fulfills that and develop athletes in a way that promotes their athletic skills and performance. Yes, we recognise the system's there, but also is active in health and well-being, promoting and developing outcomes of health and well-being, and then developing explicitly their readiness for life. Okay, and there's going to be parallels here between different models like physical literacy, not too far maybe from some of these ideas we'll talk about. So there are high-tier outcome domains of holistic talent development. So we went through a bit of a process over the last 3 years to almost test and refine that process to get towards more clear, clean parts of the work and the model. So it started with theory, and now we've done some work in some environments and really developed that with some good practical aspects. So later on in a minute, I'm going to give you a case study of a professional cricket environment looking through the lens of holistic talent development where they did some good work there. So the question is then, look at the system, look at the role of the environment, look at these outcomes. So what are the ingredients to an effective holistic talent development environment? These are our big themes. Okay, we're going to run through these. So these are our big themes. We actually identified something around 66, 67 more specific features, environmental features. 10 left. All right. And these are kind of the broad ideas. So this is based off some of that original work we looked at, and Martin-Dale work, but a bit more specific to these three outcomes. So a holistic talent development environment has community aspects. So yes, it has expert support. We've got practitioner collaboration. So working interdisciplinary practitioners, athlete collaboration, working with higher, lower role model interactions, parent support, positive engagement with parents. education integrations and working with educational practitioners. Maybe we can dive into that a little bit in a minute with some questions. So relationships are relationships between practitioners and athletes defined as a relationship that fostered individualization, trust, voice, care, and autonomy. And we've got some old models of existing models of that coach-actor relationship. This is something that applies to all practitioners. So the S&C coach, this is what we found to be the characteristics of that relationship between you and your athletes. Lifelong outlook, so a long-term development perspective, development journey, really active progress and prospect checkpoints, so actually checking in with athletes how they're getting on, they're clear on where their development is relative to their long-term goals, and then beyond sport exposure. So actually an environment that is focused on those three outcomes that delivery makes athletes aware of life beyond sport, beyond that environment, beyond school. So actually that kind of relates to athletic identity and propensity to be open to development in other different ways. And then finally, personal development, so psychosocial development and life skill development. Mitchell and Piggott are on that later. I think after they're going to go into some good detail. I think you're on maybe dual career competencies as well, so life skills a bit there as well. So these guys are going to go into some detail about specific, explicit, deliberate development of those as well. So 10 minutes to 8 minutes.
I'm not in charge.
All right. So case study then of professional cricket. So we actually looked at, it was 6 environments in total over the last 2-3 years, more or less kind of integrated in deep. So we spent, I spent 3 months in a professional cricket club looking at how they did these things. So how did they develop athletes holistically, what the outcomes they developed into those domains, and what the different environmental mechanisms that they were available in that environment that developed them. So quickly, one way that I found useful to look a lens to look through how the interaction of those outcomes and those mechanisms was this idea of kind of looking through a systems lens. Again, this is a bit of a new idea we're building into the work to make sense of the interaction of athlete outcomes and the interact with environmental mechanisms and how these things interact. Hopefully this will make a little bit more sense when we dive into the example. So 5 postulates, so 5 things that look for in a system. Systems have defining purpose. So clear goals, we know what a system is, they're defined by that purpose. Holistic kind of development. Systems are best understood as a whole, they're holism. Actually, we avoid reductionism, we look at them as a whole, we see them as their best, as their most full piece. Systems are open and unbounded, so actually it's really hard to define what a system, or the boundaries of a system. So actually, the influence all the way from international policy, or changes, huge dynamic of society will influence the system. There's no boundaries to that system, they're open. Systems are made up of integrated components. So component to us is environmental mechanisms, factors that affect development. So actually they're all connected. So one changes, they'll influence other ones around them. And the systems can react with, these are absurd words, okay? That's what we use in system literature, epifinality and multifinality. All it means is that an outcome can come through many different routes. Okay, so athletes can develop these same outcomes, let's say confidence. They can develop that within a system through different routes. Okay, so for some athletes it might happen in different ways through a combination of different environmental mechanisms or chains of mechanisms. And then the opposite of that is that multiple different mechanisms together can have different effects on different athletes. Okay, it's just a way of branching the way they interact. So, the last few minutes, and I look at the professional cricket club. Those, for the records of confidentiality, those have nothing to do with the club I was at. They're just my favourite pictures in cricket, probably for me. I'm a huge cricket fan. They're some of my best memories of cricket. And I have no idea where that ground is, but it's not the one that I was doing the study at. Where is it?
MCG?
Yeah, maybe. So, 3 months in the professional cricket club, how do they do in terms of their holistic talent development? Okay, so we're thinking about how do they impact their performance, their life skills, and their health and readiness. Okay, these are outcomes that affect across all 3 domains. Okay, so personal resilience was an outcome for them in their performance, in their health and well-being, and in their life readiness as well. So again, multiple different outcomes actually came from some of the same mechanisms. That's a word cloud from the players and parents combined. So those are the different ways that they they said, at least the players generally said, how they got better from being in this performance cricket environment. So these are 14, 15, 16-year-old boys. Some of them now playing international junior cricket, some of them playing professional cricket. They're in a major county cricket club that is very well established. These are the ways they say they got better through them when we apply a holistic talent development lens. So let's look at this idea of a system then. So systems, things are connected. So what we did, I was able to kind of look at different interaction, different mechanisms, how that had effect on outcomes. So for me, it's come back to the idea of being an open system. I challenge you then to reflect on how you fit into, say, this example. So this is a combination of different parts of that environment, and these are the outcomes that resulted from those, or were at least influenced by those. So the challenge for you is how you might fit into that. What influence might you exert from some of those factors? And really that idea that everything's very, very connected. So if something changes there, or there's a change in role, or there's more or less focus on something that's going to have an effect, and that's going to influence the outcome. So this is one example. So actually that environment was really brilliant, strong focus on the interaction, both implicit and explicit, planned and unplanned, with 14, 15-year-old academy players and those professional players that have played international cricket, regularly played county cricket, and actually the coaches of those environments. So the professional cricket coach who coached international cricket previously would be in those academy sessions sometimes. So this is kind of a basic interaction of those different features. So actually that came originally from a philosophy, something the club really wanted to do, and then we see that kind of happen through relationships between different stakeholders, so relationships between practitioners enabled this, enabled through training with professional athletes, shared social spaces, that implicit interaction. So this is in our performance environment. Again, a question how that might look at a school, for example. I'm sure it's possible in some way. And then that red arrow is an example of attention. So that's where actually there was some negative impact or negative influence. So actually, athletes generally benefit in some ways from working with professional coaches. So that second team coach, that first team coach will come down to training and work. Actually, those athletes reflect on the fact that because those coaches did not know them personally or have a good understanding of the athlete's particular learning, personalised learning needs, actually that environment felt much less psychologically safe to those athletes than it did when those coaches weren't there, to the extent that academy players talked about the fact they would not have the ex-international cricket coach in their academy because they didn't like it because they felt uncomfortable. Of course, there's nuance in that discussion, but it's an example where the attention might lie in kind of the interaction with your environment aspects. But just through this kind of thread of environment mechanisms, we've got confidence, respect, discipline, technical skills, team collaboration. Well, maybe we can come back to that if we've got during the question time possibly, but we're going to dive into the last example very, very quickly. So another example, the individual development plan, the personal development plan, the classic thing that we all aspire to do, some of us will do, I'm sure. So again, a wide range of kind of different outcomes. Interestingly, I pose this like through the process of integrating, working with a regular personal development plan that the players used, that was really well adopted and integrated into the environment. Just through the process of the PDP, athletes develop these kind of different outcomes. Some that's more or less direct. Again, it depends what the goals are, of course. But actually through the process of athletes, say, reflecting on the use of a PDP, having regular access to this goal-setting program through some technology they used, actually athletes talked about how they just developed some confidence due to their ability to reflect on their progress because they had easy access to their PDP because the way they set it up meant that they had regular records of how they were feeling and felt and developing using that PDP. And actually when the coaches then go speak to players about their goals and their progress and their chances of contracts, they could reference that as a point for athletes to also look through and then give them the kind of credence to how they might be feeling or reflecting on their progress. And again, another tension of that was managing parent proximity. So conflict between, of course, what coaches were saying, what the PDP was being used for, what's said in the PDP, and then parent views of development as well. So this is an example of a tension too. So final slide for me then. Thrown a lot at you there. I think as a final thing, I'd love to chat further, consider kind of how you view your environment relative to these goals of development. Whether we might see kind of some of this work being used in the future, again, this is early work for us, and we've got more work to really kind of explore, refine it possibly a bit. But the way we've certainly started to use it, and work we've done with governing bodies as well, has been the idea of maybe creating your own holistic talent development environment map. So with those different components of the environment, so your community, your relationship, your lifelong outlook, your personal development, can you, through your systems, then map out all the parts of your environment and see where they might having an influence on athletes' different development outcomes. So if that could be just within one small micro-environment, it could be your class, it could be across your whole kind of curriculum and program. What are those environmental tensions, positive enablers of development as well. So that's all from me. Thank you very much. I hope that's been interesting. Thank you. Good.
Yeah. I think, firstly, thank you, Barney, obviously, for sharing your insights around holistic talent development. And I do really want to challenge this group in this room to start looking at things through more of a holistic lens. And I think it goes along the theme of what we're doing here today around physical literacy. And it's not just about movement, it's also around how people are feeling, so the health and well-being, which Barney alluded to, but also like preparing people for life readiness. You know, we're in an environment where the majority of them are not going to go on to become a professional setting. So are we still advocating for health and well-being? Are we still preparing them for life beyond? And I think, you know, Tom and we're going to touch on it a little bit more on some of those exact skills in some of the next sessions, but I think it's good. Has anyone got any questions for Barney? We've got about 10 minutes. Right, Dave? Barney, do you want to come up?
Don't do Dave, I don't want Dave. Yeah,
go on, Dave.
I can wait, somebody else do it.
No, go on.
So it's about the goals, Barney, and I think, like you said, you did a lot of work to come to what was actually quite a simple set of ideas about
definitely.
goals of holistic talent development programs. And I think working in these kinds of programs for a number of years now, I don't think if you sat down and had a formal conversation with anybody who worked in those environments, I don't think anybody would argue or deny any of that. I think that's what we do. We definitely that's what we're aiming towards. But then if you spend any sort of time in those environments, you see loads of things that perhaps suggest otherwise.
Yeah.
So I was interested in some of those case studies you did and the time you spent in like the cricket club or other places. Where I suppose I'm interested in what you see, what might be the challenges. Where do you see people, maybe even just unconsciously, subconsciously, doing things that perhaps in conflict with these goals, but they maybe are not even aware that that's happening. And how do you start to interact with systems around that? Because I suspect, certainly the work that I do I do a lot of work in football clubs, that I think that's probably a lot of what's happening. It's not people are deliberately trying to undermine health and well-being or sideline the life readiness stuff or anything like that. It's just, but there's nobody there to kind of point it out and help them do otherwise.
I'll give you some thoughts on that. I think, so firstly, these are pretty standard goals. Actually, these pretty translate from goals of youth sport. So, there's nothing particularly new here, like Dave said. I think a couple of reflections then. Firstly, just coming back to that idea of systems, again, applying those same kind of postulate principles. Certainly we found that particular mechanisms can have both negative and positive effects, right? So that same that nuance and away from binary of like, this is good, this is bad, actually for certain athletes that was positive. So that example of the interaction with professional coaches. So some players, that's the best flipping thing ever because they're getting Mr. International coach coming down and giving them feedback. Actually, for some coaches, for some athletes, it wasn't far off the fact they're just saying, gives me loads of anxiety regularly when they come down to training. I just don't find it helpful at all. And we can kind of join that to idea of psychological safety a little bit. So that's, same mechanism, different effect. And then the other thing I was going to say is certainly we found that there's some kind of particular constructs that maybe that deserve more attention, that can flip things. So like athletic identity, Dave, like for me, from the work we've done, is a significant kind of construct or junction of development where that can easily be both negative and positive depending on athletes. So I think there's probably some kind of big psychological rocks in here that can affect development a little bit. And then the other thing I say, like maybe policies and structures. So it's certainly the case that yes, when I went to speak to these coaches, I'm like, yeah, these kids get the best experience in this club. They're developing the biggest life skills. Like, of course, they're like that. And actually, they do get a good experience. But everything about that policy structure, because of the integration of that environment within the professional cricket club's professional sporting structure, it's really, those coaches are going to get paid, ultimately, and they're going to get promoted, and they're going to keep their job if that academy still keeps perpetuating. So I guess that's more my point of, like, the environment can tweak and twist and prod and poke and do bits and bobs of resources, but you know, where that system constraint lies, where the fundamental principles of what the system there exists to do, is going to be limited a little bit. Is that fair? Yeah.
And I think that's probably interesting, just to piggyback off what Barney just said. It's probably a reality actually some of us face in schools, is we want to promote health and well-being, we want to promote like readiness, but our jobs on, you know, people above us might like, how many fixtures have we won? How many of the outcome? And that's maybe keeps you in your role and your job. And I think but we need to challenge that, because if we just keep letting it happen, it's never going to change. And I think that's where some of Sue's work around what she said with, you know, as a principal level and getting the message across to them around the importance is really important, because I think we still are guilty in a lot of schools around that medal and that medal focus and how and what we're doing in those environments. And I think that's where a parallel we can learn from Talent ID and schools. It's probably not that different in some of the settings that we're doing. Any other questions? Yep.
Right, thank you. This seems to be sort of a highly supportive, you're advocating for a sort of highly supportive approach, which is great, obviously,
yeah.
Arguable, but where does challenge sit within this and the preparation for the realities of not just elite sport, but also all other professions? There are some really difficult things just in the working world that I'm just wondering.
So from like challenge from the athlete development perspective, or just you're looking for like the challenges of operating something like an environment like that?
Just the role of.
So you're saying don't you say okay.
Experience,
yeah, okay. Yeah.
Everything being behind the athlete and pushing the ball.
Yeah.
Things that are
actually, let me caveat like the principle of the work, because it's the first iteration of it, was like, what can we find that they do well? So I acknowledge that, and we don't necessarily take a hugely critical perspective of so what we haven't yet looked at, and we would like to look at is what are those big junctions of mechanisms, what are those big factors in those environments that are really detrimental to holistic talent development outcomes, but outcomes across those three domains. So that would quite look to that. Help answer the question. But challenges, so we have obviously touched on a bit. So like stakeholder collaboration and engagement. So for that particular environment, parents was a big issue. So despite having some positive outcomes, parents remained as perpetually the 3 months I was there, relatively just didn't get away from the narrative of parents are a problem. Despite this environment doing some relatively sophisticated things, that remained that narrative, and had some really difficult implications. So the big challenge relating to that was in these athlete kind of reviews they would do, regular reviews, that related to their BDPs, that reflected on kind of contracts and how they're progressing. Parents didn't go to the review meetings. 14-year-olds didn't go to the review meetings. So the parents didn't go to the meetings with the 14-year-olds, and parents reflected in our interview data. I'm literally kind of peeking behind the door and hearing what's going on. Or I think he used the word, I'm just earwigging behind. I kept the door open so I can hear how my child's getting on. So the implication for that was, parent doesn't know, this is what they said, parent doesn't know how to support child, they don't know how they're getting on. And cricket's not a huge culture of cricket where at least all the parents are going for it all the time, so they're not really seeing the day-to-day training, jumping off and going. And some of these boys are coming in the work day too. So the implication, some of the parents didn't feel so they didn't have to support their kid, whether that be emotionally, psychologically, and then just their technical development as well. They might be reinforced on those aspects. So that's an example of the tension there, but it's like that. The intention from the coaches was we want to promote development, we want to promote autonomy. So the positive intention from the coaches was, well, we don't want parents there because we want to promote work ethic and discipline and respect and personal organisation, And if we have parents too close, this idea of parental proximity, then we'll somehow get rid of that, which is an unhelpful line really. Probably was a challenge for that environment for sure. That's an example in terms of the challenge of that particular program.
And just on your point around appropriate challenge, I'm actually going to touch on quite a bit of that in my next talk, but I think though one of the key things about, we've got to establish like appropriate challenge needs to be there, otherwise we're babysitting them and we're protecting them and we're not preparing them for life. But appropriate challenge can only be implemented if you have the health and well-being, the support, and if you develop them with the skills to cope with it. And that's the thing that I would advocate for is, yes, we need to challenge it. I'll touch on it a little bit more in the next, some of the next talks, but I think, the life and student athletes is demanding, that's the reality, and we can't always do that, and life is hard, and we need to expose them to that. But we also, though, in order to let them have that challenge, is to provide the health and well-being and provide the life readiness side. So I hope that helps as well with some of your questions. Maybe one more. Do you want to get it?
How, feeding back your findings to the club, how did they respond if it was perceived maybe as negative, like that parent discrepancy? Were they receptive of it, or how did they respond to your?
I'll answer a couple ways. I think first I'll answer just from a research methodological perspective around I'd done a previous study with these guys, so I'd worked with them for already a year, done bits and bobs, I'd interviewed them, been there once before I started, and then I spent 3 months with them, and in that period we did that ethnography, those observations, you're there every day with coaches and they're curious and I'm curious, so we had a really good feedback relationship there where actually we had those conversations continually, and then at the end we've done one stage of feedback to them and then still in touch, still doing bits and bobs, still giving them some stuff back. When I formally presented the results and that one challenge around parents, I don't think I got much buy-in from my argument of how they need to do better. But I'm not going to solve the parent proximity debate in half an hour with a cricket club. That's positively working with parents is a challenge that there's far more experienced research and haven't cracked yet. So I don't think I got much back from half an hour of talking about how they can do it. But I think the hope that I would have got from those conversations was raising some questions around where they're putting impetus on, say, parts of that environment that push them in terms of autonomy and individualisation and accountability. So maybe there's bits they can ease off on that, or there's ways they can work with parents through just simple communication a little bit better, and not relying just on a WhatsApp group. We'll see if they make any changes, but it's not an easy one necessarily. But hopefully I made them a bit more aware. But yeah, we'll see.
All right, can we have a round of applause for Barnaby, please? Thank you.